For a long time, the story felt simple on the surface. One family became visible. One situation pulled an attention. One fundraiser sparked hope. And then everything started to unravel. But as the layers peeled back, new names kept appearing, standing just close enough to the center to raise uncomfortable questions. Among those names, two kept coming up again and again. Friends, helpers, supporters. Men described as loyal, generous, and selfless. Or, at least, that's how the story was told. But when money enters a situation built on trust, intentions stop being assumed. They have to be examined. People were told these friends stepped in out of kindness, that they spent their own money, that they flew across states, wrote checks, paid for surveys, and backed plans that were meant to change lives. It sounded noble. It sounded generous. It sounded like sacrifice. And many believed it without hesitation. But belief isn't proof. What started to trouble people wasn't just the amount of money involved. It was the timing, the contradictions, the way details shifted depending on who was talking and who was listening. One moment, these men were portrayed as victims who lost money when plans fell apart. The next moment, they appeared calm, unconcerned, even detached, hardly the reaction you'd expect from someone who just lost thousands of dollars. That's when the questions began. If someone pays for a survey on land, where's the invoice? Where's the receipt? If money was given as seed money, who received it? If checks were written, were they ever cashed? And if they were cashed, where did the money go? These aren't accusations. They're basic questions anyone would ask when large sums are involved. Some supporters started to notice that every time these questions were raised, the conversation shifted. Instead of answers, there were distractions, emotional appeals, new crises, new explanations layered on top of old ones. The story never stayed still long enough for anyone to pin it down. And then there was the silence. When regular people lose money, they talk about it. They complain. They ask for refunds. They get angry. They demand accountability. But here, the supposed losses were met with smiles, jokes, and continued loyalty. No public frustration. No legal action. No insistence on repayment. Just acceptance. That silence spoke louder than any statement. It led some to wonder whether these men were truly victims at all, or whether they knew more than they were saying, whether they were misled, or whether they were participating in something that benefited them in ways not immediately obvious. Not necessarily through direct cash, but through exposure, influence, access, or alignment with a story that brought attention and support. Because attention has value too. Being close to a viral story brings opportunities. Followers, donations, paid appearances, platforms, even sympathy can be leveraged. And when someone is positioned as the good friend who tried to help, that role alone carries weight. It creates trust. It softens criticism. It shields people from scrutiny. That's why this matters. If these men were victims, they deserve clarity and justice like anyone else. But if they weren't, if they were active participants, knowingly or not, then the entire narrative shifts. It stops being about good intentions gone wrong and starts becoming something far more complicated. This isn't about assigning guilt. It's about understanding roles. Were they independent actors making personal choices? Or were they part of a larger performance designed to make plans look legitimate, urgent, and credible? Were their actions spontaneous or coordinated? Were they misled, or were they helping to reassure donors that everything was real, solid, and underway? Because for many supporters, their involvement was the proof. Seeing outside friends invest money made the situation feel safe. It created confidence. It suggested due diligence had been done, that someone else had checked the details. That risk had been assessed. And when that confidence collapses, people are left feeling deceived. What complicates things further is the lack of transparency afterward. No clear timelines, no documentation shared publicly, no follow-up explaining what happened to funds once plans were abandoned. Just a quiet pivot away from the promises that once fueled donations. That's not how accountability looks. People aren't asking for perfection. They're asking for honesty. They want to know whether those closest to the situation were as confused as everyone else, or whether they understood the cracks forming long before the public ever did. Because if they knew and stayed silent, that silence has consequences. This story isn't just about money lost. It's about trust broken, about how easily good intentions can be used as cover, about how quickly people are willing to believe when they see familiar faces standing beside a cause. And it's about how difficult it becomes to separate victims from participants when everyone insists they were just trying to help. As this unfolds, the hardest truth may not be about who took money, but about who helped make it possible, intentionally or not. And that's where the real questions begin. What do you think? Were they victims too? Or something else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments. As the story moved forward, the focus slowly shifted from what was promised to who stood closest when those promises were made. Because when things fall apart, proximity matters. People don't just look at the person at the center. They look at the one standing beside them, nodding along, reinforcing the message that everything is legitimate. That's where the discomfort deepened. Supporters began replaying conversations in their heads, remembering moments that felt reassuring at the time. Someone saying, "I paid for this." Someone else saying, "I flew out here myself." Those statements weren't small details. They were anchors. They grounded belief. They told people this wasn't just talk, it was action. But when action leaves no paper trail, belief turns fragile. Questions that once felt rude now felt necessary. People who lose thousands don't shrug it off. They don't keep smiling on live streams. They don't avoid the topic. They especially don't continue lending their credibility to the same narrative that allegedly cost them money. That contradiction sat heavy with a lot of viewers. It created a fork in the road. Either these men were incredibly passive, almost unrealistically forgiving, or they weren't experiencing loss in the way people were being led to believe. And if it wasn't a loss, then what was it? Some started to suggest that money may not have been the real currency here. That visibility, loyalty, and access mattered more. Being part of the inner circle carried its own benefits. It brought attention, sympathy, and a sense of importance in a story that had captured thousands of eyes. When people are positioned as helpers, they're rarely questioned. Helpers are trusted. Helpers are defended. Helpers are given grace. That role can be powerful. Others pointed out how often these men were mentioned by name, praised publicly, framed as proof that real people believed in the plan. That framing mattered. It wasn't accidental. It strengthened confidence at critical moments when doubt could have slowed donations or raised alarms. And once that trust was built, it didn't take much to keep it alive. Silence alone was enough. What unsettled people most was how quickly conversations were redirected whenever specifics were requested. Instead of receipts, there were stories. Instead of dates, there were emotions. Instead of accountability, there were reminders to focus on the good intentions. But intentions don't build houses. And intentions don't excuse missing money. As weeks passed, supporters noticed that no one from that inner circle appeared to be seeking answers publicly. No demands, no explanations, no attempts to clarify what happened behind the scenes. It was as if the collapse of the plan had already been accepted long before the public caught up. That raised another question. When did they know? Because if they knew early, if they saw signs the plan wouldn't work and stayed quiet, that silence becomes part of the damage. Not through action, but through omission, through allowing others to believe something that was already unraveling? And if they didn't know, then why didn't they react like people who had just discovered a serious betrayal? There's also the matter of alignment. Even after everything fell apart, loyalties didn't shift. Relationships didn't fracture publicly. Instead, the same voices remained supportive, defensive, and present. That consistency suggested either deep denial or shared understanding. Neither option was comforting. For donors watching from the outside, this created a feeling of being boxed out, like the truth existed somewhere behind closed doors, accessible only to a few, while everyone else was expected to accept vague explanations and move on. That sense of exclusion hurt almost as much as the financial loss. People weren't just upset about money. They were upset about being trusted enough to give, but not trusted enough to be told the full truth afterward. They felt talked around instead of talked to. And the longer that gap remained, the harder it became to believe anyone involved was truly surprised by how things ended. Some supporters tried to give the benefit of the doubt. They reminded others that people can be naive, that loyalty can cloud judgment, that friendships can make people overlook red flags. All of that is true, but naivete doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why no one asked for refunds publicly. It doesn't explain why no one distanced themselves. It doesn't explain why the same talking points were repeated without clarification. And it doesn't explain why accountability always seemed to land somewhere else. At some point, people stop asking what went wrong and start asking who benefited. Because even when money disappears, something always remains. Attention, influence, a narrative that can still be shaped. And for those who stood close to the center of the story, that influence didn't vanish when the plan did. Whether they intended it or not, their presence helped carry the story forward. Their silence helped smooth over unanswered questions. Their loyalty helped prevent deeper scrutiny. That doesn't automatically make them villains, but it does mean their role matters. And until those roles are clearly explained, the uncertainty will continue to linger, not just about money, but about trust, responsibility, and truth. What do you think? Were they caught off guard like everyone else? Or did they know more than they let on? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As time went on, the silence began to speak louder than any explanation ever could. At first, many people assumed answers were coming, that things were simply delayed, that behind the scenes, conversations were happening, refunds are being discussed, accountability was being worked out quietly. That assumption bought everyone a little patience. But patience has an expiration date. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a long stretch of unanswered questions. And during that stretch, people noticed something unsettling. The story kept moving forward, but clarity never followed. New topics surfaced. New distractions appeared. Emotional appeals replaced factual ones. The focus shifted away from outcomes and toward feelings. That shift mattered, because when outcomes disappear, feelings become tools. Supporters were reminded how hard everything was, how stressful it had been, how complicated things became, how no one could have predicted the obstacles. These statements weren't necessarily false, but they were incomplete. They spoke around the issue instead of through it. The issue was simple. Money was raised for a specific purpose. That purpose did not happen, and no clear accounting followed. Everything else was noise. What made the situation more confusing was how unified certain voices remained. The same people who had been introduced early as proof of legitimacy stayed aligned, even as trust eroded around them. There were no public disagreements, no visible fractures. The absence of transparency created space for speculation, and speculation filled the void quickly. Some began to wonder if everyone involved truly believed the plan would work, or if it had always been more symbolic than practical. a gesture meant to inspire donations rather than deliver results. The presence of supportive friends lent weight to that gesture, making it feel real enough to act on. That possibility disturbed a lot of people, because belief, once manipulated, doesn't just disappear, it collapses. And when it collapses, it leaves behind embarrassment, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. For many donors, the hardest part wasn't losing money. It was realizing they had defended the story to others, encouraged friends to give, shared links, spoken with certainty based on assurances that now felt hollow. They weren't just out funds. They were out credibility. And still, no one stepped forward to say, here's exactly what happened. Instead, explanations stayed abstract. The language remained vague. Responsibility floated without ever landing anywhere solid. It felt as though the truth existed, but only in fragments, carefully rationed, never fully assembled. People started asking a new question. Was confusion the goal? Because confusion keeps people arguing with each other instead of demanding answers from those who owe them. It divides attention. It exhausts momentum. Eventually, people stop asking, not because they're satisfied, but because they're tired. That's often when stories quietly end. But this one didn't, because too many people cared. Too many felt personally invested. Too many believed that silence, in this case, wasn't neutral, it was harmful. The presence of close allies became increasingly uncomfortable under that lens. Silence from strangers is expected. Silence from those who vouch for the plan feels different. It carries weight. It feels like a choice. And choices imply responsibility. Some supporters tried to reconcile that by assuming loyalty was blinding judgment. That friendships can make people protect one another even when things go wrong. That confronting someone publicly can feel impossible when you're emotionally entangled. Those explanations helped for a while. But then another pattern emerged. Whenever criticism grew louder, the response wasn't clarification, it was defensiveness. Questioning motives, painting skeptics as hateful or malicious, suggesting that asking for accountability was equivalent to attacking vulnerable people. That tactic worked on some, but for others, it raised red flags. Because accountability and compassion aren't opposites. You can care deeply and still demand honesty. You can feel empathy and still expect answers. Framing those things as mutually exclusive only benefits the person avoiding scrutiny. As donors connected with one another privately, a shared realization formed. Many had received the same reassurances, the same phrasing, the same confidence. That consistency felt rehearsed in hindsight. Too smooth, too uniform. It began to feel less like organic belief and more like coordinated messaging. Again, that didn't prove intent, but it did challenge innocence. People asked themselves, if this had truly fallen apart unexpectedly, wouldn't someone be angry, hurt, publicly upset? Wouldn't at least one person say, I was misled too? That moment never came. Instead, there was quiet acceptance, continued association, an unspoken agreement to move forward without revisiting the past. For those watching, that was the breaking point. Because moving forward without resolution doesn't heal wounds, it buries them. And buried wounds don't disappear. They fester. What made it worse was the sense that the story was being rewritten in real time. That what had once been framed as a concrete plan was now being described as a hope or an idea. That certainty was retroactively softened into intention. But people remembered. Screenshots existed. Recordings existed. Words don't evaporate just because they're inconvenient later. And memory is a powerful thing. As trust collapsed, attention turned outward. People began warning others, sharing timelines, comparing notes, not out of spite, but out of a desire to prevent it from happening again. That's when the narrative truly shifted. This was no longer about whether a plan failed. Plans fail all the time. This was about how failure was handled. Who spoke up? Who stayed quiet? Who benefited from the confusion? And who paid the price for believing? In that light, the question of victim versus participant became unavoidable. Because even without malicious intent, participation in a misleading narrative still causes harm. Silence still enables damage. And loyalty, when misplaced, still has consequences. The hardest truth for many to accept was that no one needed to be evil for this to go wrong. It only required enough people to prioritize comfort over honesty. And once that happens, the line between victim and accomplice starts to blur. The story wasn't over, not because people wanted drama, but because closure hadn't been earned. And until the silence breaks, until specifics replace vagueness, until responsibility is clearly claimed, that unanswered tension will remain, hanging over everyone who stood close when belief was being sold. What's your take? Does silence protect friendships, or does it damage trust beyond repair? Share your thoughts below. By the time the fourth phase of the story unfolded, something fundamental had shifted, not just in public. As more supporters began stepping back, a strange pattern emerged. Those closest to the situation appeared to move on effortlessly. There was no visible reckoning, no emotional fallout, no public frustration, no regret expressed for those who believed. That absence was jarring, because when people lose something meaningful, whether money, reputation, or trust, it usually leaves a mark. Anger, embarrassment, disappointment, something. But here, the emotional response seemed muted, almost non-existent. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if nothing was truly lost by those at the center? If a failed outcome doesn't cost you anything, there's little incentive to explain it. If confusion benefits you, clarity becomes optional. And if others absorb the loss, financially, emotionally, reputationally, then silence becomes a form of insulation. This is where the story took on a heavier weight. Because now, it wasn't just about unanswered questions, it was about imbalance. Who bore the consequences and who walked away unaffected? Supporters started recognizing how often the burden of understanding had been placed on them instead of the people who created the situation. They were expected to be patient, to be compassionate, to stop asking, to let it go. But letting go without explanation isn't closure. It's surrender. And many people weren't willing to surrender anymore. In private conversations, donors compared notes and timelines. They noticed how often emotional language had been used to soften expectations. How criticism was reframed as cruelty. How legitimate questions were dismissed as negativity or attacks. This reframing wasn't accidental, because when you redefine accountability as hostility, you protect yourself from having to answer. When you portray transparency as harm, you justify withholding it. And when you invoke empathy selectively, only when it shields you, you turn compassion into a defense mechanism. That realization stung, especially for those who had acted in good faith. They had given not just money, but belief. They had defended decisions publicly. They had trusted assurances because they were delivered with conviction. And now they were being told that asking what happened made them the problem. That reversal felt like gaslighting. And once people recognize that feeling, they don't forget it. As the conversation grew louder, another layer came into focus: proximity. Who had access? Who had influence? Who had credibility by association? And how that credibility had been used, intentionally or not, to validate the story while it was unfolding. Being close to something carries responsibility. Even if you don't control decisions, your presence communicates endorsement. Silence, in that context, isn't neutral. It reinforces the narrative by default. That's what made the role of close allies so troubling. No one expected them to fix everything, but many expected them to speak, to clarify, to acknowledge confusion, to say, "This didn't go the way we were told it would." Instead, they watched those allies stay quiet, or worse, deflect. And deflection has consequences, because it tells people that preserving relationships matters more than telling the truth. That discomfort is to be avoided, even at the expense of trust. That as long as the core circle remains intact, external damage is acceptable. That realization changed how people interpreted everything retroactively. Suddenly, earlier reassurances felt less like optimism and more like strategy. Confidence sounded rehearsed. Unity felt coordinated. And the lack of dissent looked less like agreement and more like complicity. Not because anyone necessarily intended harm, but because harm was allowed to stand unchallenged. An allowance is a form of participation. This is where the line between victim and participant became almost impossible to separate. Because even if some believed sincerely at the start, belief doesn't excuse silence once the truth becomes murky. Loyalty doesn't absolve responsibility when others are hurt. And friendship doesn't justify withholding clarity from people who are asked to give. At this stage, many supporters stopped asking whether anyone was in on it. That question felt too simplistic. Instead, they asked something deeper: who benefited from not knowing? Because ignorance, when sustained deliberately, can be profitable. Confusion delays consequences. Vagueness buys time. Emotional narratives distract from factual gaps. And while people argue among themselves, the pressure dissipates. That's why silence can be so powerful. But silence also erodes credibility. And once credibility is gone, no amount of emotional appeal can restore it. What remained was a fractured community, one side exhausted, the other entrenched. Some still defending out of loyalty or hope. Others stepping away quietly, choosing peace over confrontation. And a growing number unwilling to let the story fade without resolution. For them, this was no longer about money. It was about integrity, about whether trust means anything when it's inconvenient, about whether people with influence feel obligated to those they persuade, about whether harm caused unintentionally still deserves acknowledgement, and perhaps most importantly, about whether silence is an acceptable response when others are left holding the consequences. Because in the end, stories like this don't collapse under scrutiny. They collapse under avoidance. And avoidance, when repeated long enough, becomes its own answer. Do you think silence in moments like this is self-protection or a form of responsibility avoidance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By the time the final stage of this story unfolded, most people weren't waiting for explanations anymore. They were waiting for honesty. Not polished statements, not emotional reframing, not vague reassurances that everything would make sense eventually. What people wanted, what they needed, was a plain acknowledgement. Because when a situation collapses and no one steps forward to say, "This failed, and here's why," the silence speaks louder than any accusation ever could. It tells people that their role was transactional, not relational. That their belief mattered only while it was useful. That once questions replaced praise, their presence became inconvenient. That realization hurt more than any financial loss. Many supporters began reflecting not just on what they gave, but on how they were treated afterward. They remembered moments when they defended decisions publicly, when they pushed back against skeptics, when they trusted reassurances because they believed those involved wouldn't mislead them. Those memories now carried a different weight. Because trust, once broken, doesn't disappear quietly. It rewrites the past. It changes how every interaction is remembered. Every confident statement becomes suspect. Every emotional appeal feels calculated in hindsight. And that's the real damage. Not the money, not the failed plans, but the erosion of good faith. People started to recognize how often emotional language had been used as a shield, how criticism was framed as cruelty, how accountability was portrayed as harassment. These weren't accidental patterns. They were responses, reflexive defenses against discomfort. But discomfort is not harm. Being asked to explain yourself is not abuse. Being questioned after soliciting trust is not persecution. And being held to your own words is not unfair. Those distinctions matter, because once you blur them, you create a world where accountability is impossible, where anyone who asks what happened becomes the villain, where silence is justified as self-care, where responsibility is optional. And that's where this story ultimately landed. Not in outrage, not in resolution, but in disillusionment. Some supporters quietly walked away, unwilling to argue anymore. Others stayed vocal, not because they enjoyed conflict, but because they believed unresolved harm shouldn't be buried under fatigue. A few remained loyal, holding on to the belief that silence meant complexity, not avoidance. But even among them, doubt lingered, because complexity doesn't require secrecy, and integrity doesn't fear clarity. The most telling moment wasn't something that happened. It was something that didn't. No clear timeline was offered. No transparent breakdown was provided. No sincere acknowledgement of confusion was made. Instead, there was a collective shrug where answers should have been. And that's when many people stopped asking who was a victim and who was complicit. They realized the question itself was flawed. Because harm doesn't require malice. Participation doesn't require intent. Silence doesn't require guilt. Sometimes, all it requires is the decision to protect yourself rather than confront the consequences of influence. And influence is the key word here. When you ask people to believe, to support, to give, you assume a position of influence, whether you want it or not, whether you feel prepared or not, whether the outcome goes as planned or not. Influence carries obligation, not perfection, not success, but accountability. And when accountability is absent, people fill the void themselves. They speculate. They connect dots. They form conclusions based on what they can see, which, in this case, was very little. That vacuum became the story's final chapter. Not because people wanted drama, but because unanswered questions don't dissolve on their own. They linger. They spread. They harden into lessons. Lessons about trust, about transparency, about how easily good intentions can be overshadowed by poor follow-through, about how silence can undo years of goodwill in a matter of weeks. In the end, what people were left with wasn't anger. It was clarity. Clarity about how quickly narratives can shift. Clarity about the risks of emotional investment without safeguards. Clarity about the importance of asking questions early, not apologizing for them later. Clarity about who speaks when things are going well, and who disappears when they aren't. And perhaps the most sobering clarity of all, that silence is a choice that protects some while leaving others to carry the weight alone. A choice that prioritizes comfort over truth. A choice that turns supporters into afterthoughts. Stories like this don't end with answers. They end with boundaries. People become more cautious, less trusting, more deliberate about where they place their belief. They learn to separate empathy from endorsement, compassion from compliance, support from surrender. And while that may feel like loss, it's also growth. Because trust should never require silence. And belief should never come without accountability. Do you think silence after influence is exercised is ever acceptable? Or does accountability come with the territory